The flight attendant placed a napkin on my tray table. Her hands were trembling. Scribbled in hurried ink were the words, "Fake that you are sick. Get off this plane right now." I looked up at her in disbelief. Her eyes were not filled with irritation or confusion. They were filled with sheer panic and fear. She leaned closer and whispered, "Please, I'm begging you." At that moment, I didn't know if this was a prank, a mistake, or something far more serious. But what happened just 2 hours later proved one thing. Her warning wasn't just real. It was the reason I'm still alive today. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. This story could happen to anyone. My name is Nayala Juba. I'm a 30-year-old travel nurse who has seen enough human suffering for a lifetime. I've held the hands of patients taking their last breaths. I've comforted families in hospital hallways. After months of non-stop work, I decided to take a short break and surprise my mother in New York. She had just recovered from heart surgery, and she kept saying my voice was helping her heal faster. I couldn't wait to see her face when I showed up unannounced. It was a regular afternoon at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, ATL. People were laughing, kids were pressing their faces against the terminal windows watching the plane's taxi, and business travelers were tapping away on their laptops. I felt tired, but at peace. I whispered a quick prayer of gratitude because life was finally starting to feel stable again. As I boarded the flight, I noticed the flight attendants greeting passengers with practiced smiles. But one of them, her name tag read Asha, was different. She wasn't just polite, she was observing. Her eyes scanned every person boarding as if she were memorizing faces. When our eyes met, she hesitated for half a second, almost as if she recognized me, and then quickly looked away. My seat was near the middle of the aisle. Across from me sat a man in a black jacket who kept moving nervously. He opened the overhead compartment twice, even though he wasn't putting anything inside. Next to him, a silent teenager hugged a backpack close to his chest. Nothing seemed overtly out of place, but the atmosphere wasn't the usual pre-flight chatter. There was subtle tension, like a quiet storm brewing under clear skies. I texted my sister, Zola. "Boarded the flight. Mom has no idea I'm coming. Get ready to film her reaction." She replied with heart emojis and reminders to bring her the special sweet potato cookies from the airport bakery. Everything felt quite normal as I buckled my seatbelt and adjusted it. But then I noticed Asha again. She moved slowly down the aisle, pretending to check the overhead bins, but her eyes weren't on the luggage. They were on the people. She looked terrified of someone, but I couldn't tell who. As she reached my row, she leaned down as if placing a napkin on my tray. She never made eye contact, never changed her expression, and then kept walking. I unfolded the napkin. "You are not safe. Fake that you are sick. Get off this plane immediately." My mind went blank. For 1 second, I thought it was a joke. Maybe someone was filming reactions for a social experiment. Maybe this was some kind of mistake. But when I glanced back at Asha, she had stopped at the end of the aisle. She turned slowly and fixed her eyes on me. There was no humor on her face, no confusion, just urgency. My pulse began to race. I looked around to see if anyone else had received a napkin. Everyone seemed calm. No one else seemed alarmed. Something was happening, and I was the only passenger being warned. I didn't know what to believe, but one thing was for sure. I couldn't ignore the look in her eyes. If you want to know what happened when I stayed seated and why this flight changed every part of my life, stick with me. And don't forget to subscribe and comment your state or city below. This is a story the world needs to hear. The napkin lay on my lap like a ticking time bomb, every word echoing in my mind. "You are not safe. Fake that you are sick. Get off this plane immediately." My gut screamed at me to do something, but logic kept me frozen in place. I subtly looked toward Asha, the flight attendant, who was near the galley with her back straight and her eyes fixed, not on me, but on 2 passengers sitting 3 rows ahead. Her posture wasn't casual. She was on guard, as if preparing for something to happen. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe she handed the note to the wrong person. Maybe it wasn't even for me. But then she turned around again, and for a split second, her eyes locked with mine, and I saw something that shattered every excuse forming in my thoughts. Pure fear. That wasn't the face of someone playing a prank. That was the face of someone trying to save a life. I scanned the cabin for anything unusual. A man in a gray hoodie sat rigidly in a window seat, his hands clutching the edge of the armrests as if bracing for impact. Across the aisle, a woman in a business suit kept rapidly tapping her foot, glancing toward the front of the plane instead of focusing on her book. But what made my skin crawl was the man in the black jacket near the emergency exit. He wasn't nervous. He was too calm, too focused. His gaze kept flicking toward the cockpit door and then toward Asha, as if waiting for a signal. I shifted in my seat and tried to steady my breathing. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe someone on board was having a medical emergency or a mental crisis. Maybe. And then I noticed something that made my heart flip. The overhead compartments above the first-class cabin had been sealed shut with bright yellow zip ties, something I'd only seen once during an in-flight security hazard training video. My nursing experience had taught me to read situations quickly. Something wasn't right here. Something was being contained, monitored, controlled. Before I could process it, Asha suddenly approached me, pretending to check my seatbelt. She leaned in, her voice barely audible. "Do it now. Say you feel faint. If you stay on this flight, you won't land alive." I wanted to talk, to ask questions, but her expression stopped me. It wasn't fear for herself, it was fear for me. She straightened up, smiled mechanically, and continued down the aisle. My body tingled with adrenaline. I slowly reached out to press the call button to signal that I needed assistance. But before pressing it, I hesitated. If this was real, what if calling attention made things worse? What if faking sickness triggered the danger she was warning me about? My fingers grazed the button when a loud thud echoed from the back of the plane, as if someone had dropped something heavy. Instantly, all heads turned. A male flight attendant rushed toward the noise, and I caught a glimpse of his ashen face. Behind him, the teenager who had been clutching his backpack was rapidly breathing into his hands. His eyes darted with panic, but his panic didn't seem like fear of flying. It looked like fear of being exposed. He kept whispering to himself, "I can't do this. I can't do this," as if someone had forced him onto the plane against his will. Suddenly, the plane's engines shifted pitch as it began taxiing faster toward the runway. My heart pounded. This was it. Once the plane was airborne, any chance of safe intervention would vanish. I looked out the window at the terminal we were leaving behind and realized with a deep certainty that I was about to make the most important decision of my life. Then, my phone vibrated in my hand with a text from my sister. "Send me a picture of the plane. Want to post it before Mom sees you." A moment of agonizing clarity washed over me. She had no idea. No one did. I quickly typed, "Something's wrong. Pray for me." My finger hovered. Then I hit send. As the plane swerved onto the runway, I suddenly felt a wave of dizziness. Not faked, but real, brought on by sheer terror. My vision blurred, and I realized doing nothing was the most dangerous option of all. I unbuckled my seatbelt and stood up, trembling. A few passengers turned to look at me with irritation, assuming I was causing a delay, but I didn't care. As I moved into the aisle, the man in the black jacket slowly turned his head toward me. His eyes were cold, assessing, like a predator noticing an unexpected move from its prey. At that very moment, Asha appeared at my side, placing a firm hand on my arm, not to stop me, but to guide me. Her voice was calm, but her words were chilling. "Follow me if you want to live." Asha kept her hand firmly on my arm, as if assisting a sick passenger, but the grip was too intentional to be purely supportive. The eyes of the man in the black jacket flickered with suspicion as he slowly rose from his seat, pretending to stretch. All my senses went on high alert. Asha guided me toward the front of the plane, her voice loud enough for others to hear. "Ma'am, take a deep breath. We'll get you some water." But just as we reached the galley, she leaned in and whispered in a low, urgent tone, "Don't look back. Someone is watching you. Your seat was not assigned by accident." My chest tightened as I sat in the jump seat near the exit door. The male flight attendant moved to her side, pretending to fetch oxygen. Asha's lips barely moved as she continued. "The person targeting that seat believes you are someone else. If you stay on this flight or return to your seat, they will act during cruising altitude." My thoughts raced. How could my seat be the target? It was a clear case of mistaken identity. And if I was sitting in a seat meant for another person, who was that seat for? Asha reached into a compartment and subtly slid a small device toward her colleague. A silent signal passed between them. The colleague nodded and quickly walked away. As the plane continued to taxi, I watched Asha's professional calm begin to crack. Her breathing quickened slightly as she made a call to the cockpit, requesting an emergency return to the gate due to a medical escalation. The captain's voice responded with hesitation, asking for confirmation, and that's when I saw it. Asha looked over my shoulder, past the curtain, and locked eyes with someone. The expression on her face hardened. The captain then announced we were experiencing a brief delay and would be returning to the gate. The atmosphere instantly changed. Passengers began murmuring with irritation, grumbling loudly. But beneath the surface noise, I sensed something deeper. Panic from certain individuals whose plans were being interrupted. The man in the black jacket was fully standing now. His calm demeanor was gone. He glanced toward the cockpit door, then toward me, then toward the overhead bins, as if calculating every angle behind him. The silent teenager gripped his backpack even tighter, his lips moving rapidly as if he were praying. The woman in the business suit pulled out her phone and began furiously texting. Her hands were shaking. Asha positioned herself between me and the aisle, blocking their line of sight, as if she knew any sudden move toward the exit could trigger chaos. "You have to choose right now," she whispered, while keeping a professional smile for appearances. "If you get off this plane, your life will be turned upside down. But if you stay, you won't get another chance to make it out alive." My heart hammered against my ribs. I thought of my mother waiting in New York, thinking I was only a few hours away. I thought of my sister, probably laughing in her dorm room, editing a funny video about surprising Mom. Then I thought about the fact that if Asha was right, my family would never see me again. The plane was turning back toward the terminal, but we were still moving. If the threat was desperate, they might act before we reached the gate. Asha unbuckled her belt and moved to the intercom. Her voice remained professional, but I noticed the slight tremor in it as she said, "Flight attendants, prepare doors for arrival." The engine slowed. The runway lights reflected in the windows. Suddenly, the teenager stood up abruptly, his face pale. "I need to get off this plane, please," he said loudly. His voice cracked with genuine terror. A wave of confusion rippled through the cabin. It was clear now he wasn't the only one who had been warned or threatened. Before anyone else could react, the man in the black jacket reached into his carry-on bag with a deliberate movement. Asha immediately stepped forward, raising her hand sharply. "Sir, please take your seat," she ordered. But he froze mid-motion when he noticed the cockpit door open and two uniformed air marshals silently enter the aisle from first class. That's when I realized this whole situation was far more complex than the action of a single crew member. There was already an active federal operation underway, and somehow I had been placed right in the center of it. As the air marshals moved down the aisle, having been disguised as regular passengers until that moment, Asha looked at me and said softly, but firmly, "You were never the target, but now you are the key." My breath caught. Every nerve in my body told me that this moment, right here, was the dividing line between my old life and whatever came next. I nodded once. "I want to get off this plane," I said out loud, my voice steady, even though my hands were shaking. That sentence was my decision. Asha exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath. She stepped aside, signaling the air marshal. The plane hadn't even fully stopped before the marshals secured the aisle and prepared for immediate evacuation. I had made my choice, and there was no going back. The plane had barely come to a full stop when everything erupted at once. The seatbelt signs were still illuminated, but two federal air marshals were already moving down the aisle with controlled urgency. Passengers hadn't been told the true reason for our return, so confusion spread in murmurs that quickly turned to alarm when one of the marshals reached the row where the man in the black jacket was seated. Instead of complying, the man slowly rose, his expression unreadable, almost bored. His cold eyes shifted first to me, then to the cockpit, then back to the approaching marshal. In that instant, his hand darted into his jacket. Before he could pull anything out, the marshal shouted an order, and the man froze, realizing he had been outmaneuvered. But that was only the first trigger. A second man sitting near the emergency exit suddenly lunged for the door lever. The whole cabin gasped. A flight attendant jumped forward to block him, but he shoved her back with surprising force. The teenager in the back yelled, "Don't open it! It's not what you think!" His voice wasn't one of fear, it was devastation, as if he knew something horrible was about to happen. Passengers began to panic, some ducking, others screaming. Children were crying. The woman in the business suit, who had been nervously texting, stood up and tried to push her way through the crowd, only to be restrained by a second marshal. She screamed, "You don't understand, it's about to activate." Her face had gone bloodless. The word sent a cold shock through me. Activate. What was about to activate? I looked at Asha, who was already urgently pressing the intercom. Her voice was firm. "Remain in your seats. Do not touch any overhead compartments." Her calm tone didn't match the fear in her eyes. She took a step into the aisle and nodded to one of the marshals, who then reached up and pulled down a specific overhead compartment, the one directly above where I had originally been assigned. Inside was not a bag. It was a sealed, wired device the size of a lunchbox, with a small blinking indicator light. The cabin went silent. People stared in disbelief. The man in the black jacket smiled, not with victory, but with the satisfaction that we had finally seen the truth. He had waited for this moment. The agents moved with quick precision. One secured the man by zip-tying his hands behind his back as he stared blankly forward, as if he had already accepted his fate. The other agent used a scanner on the device, but didn't touch it. Asha stepped closer, keeping her eyes on the criminals, while the teenager continued to repeat, "I wasn't supposed to be here today. They changed the flight. They changed the target." His voice trembled with guilt. He wasn't an accomplice, he was a witness, or worse, someone forced into participation. The cockpit door burst open and the captain stepped out, his face pale. He looked straight at Asha. "Is it active?" he asked. She nodded grimly. The tension in the air was suffocating. Asha turned to me with a look that made my heart turn over. "That device was placed below seat 14C, your seat." My breath hitched. I had been assigned 14C that morning after changing my reservation to an earlier flight to surprise my mother. My seat change hadn't been random, it had been intercepted. If I hadn't received that napkin, if I had stayed seated, if Asha hadn't noticed the change, I wouldn't have gotten off that plane alive. But the nightmare didn't end there. As police began evacuating passengers row by row, the woman in the business suit continued screaming to anyone who would listen. "It's remotely activated. Is anyone on the ground?" Those words ignited a fresh wave of terror. The marshals immediately mobilized, alerting ground control. Emergency response units surrounded the plane. Everyone was being funneled out the back door furthest from the device. When my turn came, Asha placed a firm hand on my shoulder. Her voice was low and steady. "It was never about you. They thought a federal informant would be sitting in your seat, someone with confidential documents. They targeted Flight 14 for a political assassination. You unknowingly boarded in their place." As we walked out onto the jetway, I saw 3 men in tactical gear sprinting down the hallway toward the terminal. Something was still happening. I heard shouts from the gate area. People were running. The teenager, now in protective custody, looked at me with tears in his eyes and said more to himself than anyone. "They said no one would know. They said no one would get hurt, except the target." It became clear that this wasn't random violence. It was a calculated hit, designed to look like an in-air accident. A covert operation, and I had nearly been the face on every news broadcast in the country. Just as I fully entered the terminal, my phone, still in airplane mode, vibrated repeatedly the moment it reconnected to service. Texts from my mother, my sister, missed calls from unknown numbers. Then a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. I hit play. My hands were shaking. A distorted voice said, "We know you got off the plane. This isn't over." That was the moment I realized I wasn't just a survivor. I was now involved in a battle I never asked to fight. And the people behind this weren't done with me yet. I stood in the terminal surrounded by flashing lights, federal agents, and panicked passengers. But in that moment, every sound felt distant, as if I were underwater. The voicemail kept echoing in my mind. "This isn't over." My hands were shaking, not just because of what nearly happened, but because of the reality that I had unknowingly walked into something far bigger than myself. An agent with a firm but compassionate expression approached me and said they were moving me to a secure holding area away from the public. She explained that the suspects were part of a domestic extremist group that had been planning targeted attacks disguised as aviation accidents. They had identified a specific federal whistleblower who was supposed to be traveling on this flight under a protected identity. That whistleblower had canceled at the last minute without their knowledge. My seat, the one they targeted, was originally assigned to him. That's when it hit me. I was alive not by chance, but because a woman I had never met chose to act on instinct rather than on routine. If Asha had ignored her gut, if she had shrugged off the seat change, if she had been 1 minute too late, I would have been part of a breaking news headline, not a living person telling my story. As federal agents led me away, I walked past embracing families, passengers crying with relief, and people angrily demanding answers from airline staff. Their lives had been interrupted, their travel plans ruined, but in time, they would understand. Those inconveniences had saved them. I was escorted to a small private room where I finally saw Asha again. She no longer wore the serene expression of a flight attendant. She was an undercover federal agent, and that napkin wasn't just a warning. It was the first step in saving hundreds of lives that day. When our eyes met, I broke down. Not with fear this time, but with gratitude. She walked over and placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "I need you to know something," she said softly. "You were never supposed to be in danger, but when I saw the look in your eyes, I knew you were strong enough to hear the truth." Her words settled in my heart. All my life, I had been the one helping others, patients, families, strangers in crisis. But that day, I had to trust someone else to save me. Over the next few hours, I gave my statement. I learned that the teenager had been coerced by the extremist group and had subtly tried to signal his distress by clutching his backpack. The woman in the business suit was actually an undercover agent from another branch, monitoring the suspects from a different angle. Multiple agencies had been tracking this operation for weeks. The decision to halt the flight wasn't random. It was triggered the moment Asha slipped me that napkin, because I reacted, because I moved, because I didn't ignore the warning signs. What I thought was fear turned into my greatest protection. What I thought was panic was actually clarity. Later that night, I was taken to a secure hotel with federal protection. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My phone was constantly buzzing with messages from family and friends who had seen the breaking news about a major threat prevented at ATL. My sister finally connected on a protected line, sobbing with relief. My mother's voice cracked when she heard mine. I felt the tears fall down my face as I realized how close I had come to never hearing her voice again. I expected to feel weak, traumatized, broken, but instead I felt something unexpected. Purpose. If this had been my last day on Earth, I would have left without telling the world what I had seen, what I had learned, that danger often hides behind ordinary moments, that a single warning can save your life if you are willing to listen. In the days that followed, I cooperated with authorities as they dismantled the larger network behind the attack. My story was never released with all the details due to ongoing investigations, but what I experienced changed the course of my life. I stopped living passively. I started paying attention, not with fear, but with awareness. I promised myself I would never again dismiss my instincts or ignore the signals others tried to give me. Today, I share this story because you deserve to know that sometimes your life depends on a choice you never expected to make. You may never be handed a napkin with a warning written on it, but you might feel uneasy in a situation, notice something strange, or hear a voice inside you telling you to act. Don't ignore it. Your gut is not panic, it is protection. And sometimes, protection comes in the form of a stranger begging you to listen. If this story opened your eyes or made you feel grateful to be alive today, make sure to subscribe right now and comment where you're watching from. Your comment might remind someone else to pay attention, and that reminder could save a life. Did you like the story, and which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new live stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next live story with love and respect.